on accommodation. I'm gonna spend some time on accommodations, what they look like, some of the issues that programs tend to have. I have some videos that we've developed that I'll use, that if they're helpful for you, just let me know and I'll give you access to them. And then what I wanted to do, so we'll spend a little bit of time around accommodations, and then I wanted to talk about how we could, like, how I could help tribal programs with this information. So like, does the information feel, like, I'll just say what I don't want to do. Okay. What I don't want to do is go to tribal programs and say, you can do this, and ignore all the aspects of, resources and staffing and, like different aspects of it. So I want to just kind of like think through how to do that. And then also how to, like, should I lean, because I have some stuff that focuses on law enforcement and prosecution or attorneys. And I haven't brought that necessarily into this training, but I can show you some of the stuff that, like, the videos that I've been using for that, to get your thoughts on them. So I'll first cover the material on accommodations, and then we'll have a discussion. Okay, so, all right, so let me find the right spot. And then I'll share my screen. And oh, the other thing is, I thought I would go through the accommodation section, and then we'll take a break and then do a discussion. That way I can let the dogs in and get something to drink, all that fun stuff. Okay. Oh, I'm gonna share sound, video. And so I'm gonna start my Okay, so do you see one slide or two slides?
One slide.
Perfect. Okay. All right, so we're gonna talk about accommodations. And mostly what we're gonna do is talk about kind of what people with disabilities say that they need. And then also, what are some of the challenges, like, within the accommodations, what are some of the challenges that we've seen with programs, and ways of kind of addressing that. So first I want to start with this little video that we did, of people with disabilities, and mostly Black and brown people with disabilities, talking about the importance of accommodations.
Creating access for victims with disabilities. The term accommodations refers to modifications in the environment, policies, and procedures, or the provision of auxiliary aids and services to allow people with disabilities to engage fully in services. When accommodations are not provided, people with disabilities may be unable to meaningfully engage and communicate. Keith Jones.
There's 1.7 billion people on the planet with disabilities. And the new definition of disability is that the disability doesn't reside in the person, it resides in the environment.
Kathy.
Even down to the architectural barriers, most of the people that build the buildings and build the things for disabled populations do not have disabilities themselves. They've never used a wheelchair. They've never been blind. They've never had an intellectual or cognitive disability or delay. So they're doing it from their perspective.
Max Barrows.
I would say like some of the committees and boards that I serve on the state, sometimes I don't get the material ahead of time in plain language, or as in other words, an accessible format for me to understand what's going to happen or what's going on in the committee meeting or board meeting that I have to like attend. So as a ripple effect, there's no way I can have much of a say in like what's going on if I don't get those accommodations.
Heather.
Part of it is stigma, but I also think that there is a lack of understanding about making reasonable accommodations. In some organizations, there's a lot of focus on we have to treat everybody the same or it's not going to be equal. You know, we have to treat everybody with the same set of rules, and there's no room for interpretation in order to work to the ability, the best abilities and the strengths of that particular person.
So when you only view me as a problem and a burden, you treat me as such. When you view me as a human that can contribute, you treat me as such.
Service providers and criminal justice professionals should know how to ask about and provide reasonable accommodations to victims with disabilities so that their needs can be met. Keisha.
After a sexual assault on a Greyhound bus, I went to the police station with my mom. The police department had me fill out some very difficult, hard to understand paperwork. I did not understand it whatsoever. The police did not give me any accommodations. It was clear to me that the police officer and the police department in general did not know how to interact with people with disabilities. I was aware that my report was not being taken seriously.
Keith Jones.
So the importance of providing accommodation to an individual with a disability in a criminal justice or police involved in situation is that if you're law enforcement, you want to have the most accurate and most pertinent details possible. You also want to provide to that individual that called you the best possible service, because that's your job. And if you want to find out and get to the end of whatever you're dealing with, communication access is necessary. Cultural understanding, cultural rights and safety and things like that should be part of, just the general understanding. But providing any kind of accommodation and or access is the end goal, is to make sure that the person who has been a victim of a crime actually receives justice. If you don't do that, it'll make it incredibly hard for you to do your job and for that individual who expects you to do your job to receive justice.
The National Resource Center for Reaching Victims, helping those who help others.
So, so I like that video a lot because, it's people with disabilities talking about their experience. And also it covers a range of different disabilities. We have, people that are wheelchair users, people with autism, people with intellectual disabilities, all talking about it. So I like that. So the challenge of, I work a lot with Keith, and one of the biggest challenges that Keith has identified is that if we don't look at the intersection of race and disability, that then people with disabilities who are Black, Indigenous, or other people of color don't feel they fit in anywhere. And and he tells about this experience of being at a conference. It was actually one that Vera did, and they had different groups meeting, and one group was for men, for Black men. And when he showed up, everyone in that room stopped talking and looked at him, and then didn't engage with him, which he found really, like he was really surprised by it. And it was that they didn't know kind of what to do about the fact that he was a person with a disability. And I always find that really kind of profound, and it matches my experience of being a person who's Latinx and also a person with a disability. And it's usually one part of my identity that is taken in and not the other. And that was a big problem for me at Lupe, at a program that I co-founded, where my disability wasn't like I was having a hard time working with quite honestly with Ruby, because I would talk about the accommodations I would need and she wasn't able to actually do it. And so I always kind of feel a little out of place when both things aren't, or all the ways in which someone identifies aren't there. So anyways, and also, as I'm going to go through some of the slides around accommodations, but if you have any questions or comments along the way, just stop me. Okay. Okay, so there are different types of accommodations. So everybody knows, right, that the Americans with Disabilities Act requires, that people get reasonable accommodations if they need it. The ADA doesn't cover everyone. It doesn't cover really small organizations that wouldn't be able to make, and I think the number, I want to say the number is 50, that you need to have 50 employees. So a lot of people don't pay attention to it, but everybody that receives a federal grant has to comply with the ADA because it's part of our special conditions. So, and most people think about the ADA as being the ceiling. I think it's really important for the ADA to be the floor. So, and what's really interesting to me as I've been working with first Vera and now Activating Change is that, and I do it myself, that the first thing you think of when you think of accommodations is you think of physical barriers. But there's a lot you can do that doesn't require physical barriers. There's a lot more. There are a lot more problems for people around communication than anything else. And that falls into a bunch of different categories. So, but to make reasonable accommodations to policies, practices, procedures, wherever necessary to ensure for safety and access, it's effective communication. So that might mean auxiliary aids, and I'll walk through these, or assistive technology. Well, actually, let me stop for a second. So auxiliary aids are services or devices that enable effective communication. And that might be like assistance with filling out forms, assistive listening systems, audio recordings, having things in Braille, communication boards, computer aided real-time transcription, which is CART, which a lot of people use for their webinars. That's actually a good process for webinars, just as a norm. Large print materials that are electronic, in electronic format, open or closed captioning, qualified interpreters, qualified readers, screen readers. That's usually for, those are the preferred devices. Screen readers are the preferred devices. of people who are blind. And, you know, video relay, video interpreting services are really helpful for deaf community, deaf survivors. So those are just, you know, just a list of the kinds of auxiliary aids that someone might use. Assistive technology for people who have disabilities, who often have difficulty performing daily activities. So ADLs are self-care activities that include things like toileting, mobility, eating, bathing, dressing, and grooming. They promote greater independence by enabling people to perform these tasks that if they couldn't perform, they wouldn't be able to be independent. And these are like everyday type of things, like wheelchairs for people who, you know, with mobility disabilities. Assistive eating devices can help people who have difficulty feeding themselves. So there's a bunch of different resources and the people who kind of help the most around this are independent living centers, and they're about 600 across the country. And then there's physical access, which is what we normally think of when we're thinking about disabilities, people who have limited mobility. Physical access doesn't always mean, you know, creating ramps or widening doorways. Physical access could mean something like, I was at a program in DC that has their a legal services program. And when I got there, I immediately knew they wanted me to do an access review. I immediately knew we were going to have a problem because it was from the street to their house, to the opening of the house. I had to go up 3 sets of stairs. And I was like, oh yeah, no. And then we looked around the back and there was 2 sets of stairs to get in through the back. So then what we talked about was, you know, when they do the intake for someone who needs legal services, they could ask about accommodations, ask if they, you know, let people know our houses, you know, there's a number of stairs to go to our house. Will that be an issue for you? And if they say yes, then they'll meet them someplace else. So there's a nonprofit that they partner with a lot of times. It's very accessible. It's in a new building. And so they meet people there where they would get this accessible space and also, you know, quiet space with privacy for legal, you know, so they don't have to worry about privilege and stuff like that. So
Can I just chime in for one thing? So this has been kind of on my mind recently because I've realized that even though I really do try to like be thinking about like, you know, universal design or all these sorts of things,
exactly.
and I'm doing ITA and all this kind of stuff. There was this like gap because I think I have a now like assumption that places will be accessible, right? And I'm like, oh, in this day and age, we have to be, which is not correct. But we had a training recently, and it was interesting because we didn't even necessarily ask about those kind of accommodations because we assumed that like, no, our meeting space was up like 20 stairs, which was hard to get up, right? You know, my hotel room was also up icy stairs. We're adding the icy part because that's its own like little barrier. But it was just interesting because, you know, we did our due diligence, right? You know, like we looked into the space, all this kind of stuff. And it was just something where it made me really realize that I'm like, oh, even if we've tried our darndest, and sometimes like we need to sometimes be incredibly explicit with some of these things.
Yeah.
And so that was just like last month. And so it's been kind of on my brain ever since then. And so that was interesting. There's a couple of us who had to deal with like stairs, and it was like, oh, wow.
It's a really, really good point because here, I'm going to stop share for a second because I like to see people. It's a really good point. And it's, so whenever we have a conference, we do an access review. And we tend to use Marriott's because they tend to be the most accessible. So if you're planning a conference the problem is when you go to like NSAC, right, where it's their hotel, their conference, and you're hosting something. But when you're doing a conference, if you want some help in terms of doing the access review, you can reach out to us. Sandra's
That would be
done
really, do you guys have like even like a form that you go through? And like, it'd be
Yeah.
really helpful to have someone with the access review. Like we have our sex trafficking conference coming up. Of course, we already
Right.
do the site visit, but it's not like a lens that I look at always, you know,
Exactly.
like,
And even when I, oh wow, that was a Marriott hotel. Okay. So I did an access review for these folks and Sandra walked me through it. It's even in how you measure stuff. Like I would measure a doorway and I need to make sure that it's 33 to 36 inches, you know, no less than 33, but I have to measure it from the doorknob to not the jamb, not the door jamb, but from the doorknob to, because that's where that's gonna hook onto people's wheelchairs. It's kind of looking, and she's so good at it. So we do have a form. We also have an online training, but then also, you know, we can set up a meeting to talk it through. Like we can't, I mean, unless, like, I don't think you want to pay us to go and do it. I think you want us to coach you through it. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I
So
want you on everything with me,
I
but
know, right? But you travel way more than I want to, Jolene. So
how the tables have turned.
how they have.
and that one was a Marriott, but it was not a Marriott hotel. It was a Marriott resort. And those are very different spaces.
different.
So, but yeah, it was challenging. Even for someone who has RA, like my knees aren't always,
Yeah.
like I have a hard time with stairs sometimes. So, yeah, I'm thankful I wasn't in Jolene's room where I had to go up the icy stairs.
Oh my gosh. Oh yeah, because that makes sense as a resort that they're gonna take places that they're not usually. Yeah. So that's a totally something we can help you with. And Jolene, if you want, I can set up a time for us to meet with Sandra. Or if more people want to be involved, then I can check with Sandra and her times and then set something up.
Yeah, that would be great. I think that's the thing. Like, none of us want to be doing what I call like bare minimum accessibility.
Yeah.
You know, I'm like, we don't want to check the box on things. We really want to create spaces. And I think that's one of my, not issues with communities, but sometimes it is. They're like, well, we just don't have anybody with disabilities in our community. And I'm like, folks, like, let's just have some conversation and really think about how are we creating things that are both designed around and for, and hopefully by, right?
Yeah.
But at the very least, like having it intentionally from the onset versus trying to be like, oh, you are like this an addition that we have to always, you know, add on.
When I went to Vera and then activating change, I went on the condition that I could work with culturally specific programs and tribal communities, because everybody who has gotten disability funding are mainstream programs. And if you think about like what causes disability, so first people are, you know, congenital, people are born with disabilities, but then people acquire them. So and some disabilities are because of the life of the mother, right? And then, so if you think about Black and Brown communities, we experience, our families have experienced all that trauma. You guys know this. So you think that there would be more people with disabilities that are Black and Brown, and those programs don't have the luxury oftentimes of applying for those grants. One, because they might not have a grant writer, or they're just overwhelmed because they're, you know this, that historically it's been mainstream programs that have gotten all the funding, and they've been able to build the infrastructure that then, you know, culturally specific programs couldn't compete with them. And so it's only been really since the culturally specific grants that more culturally specific programs have been funded. But I was like, I want to be working with those folks to help their communities, not a whole bunch of white people. So anyway, so I'm excited to do that. And this is part of it. It's kind of like thinking about, and also if you do it, then you become a model for the tribes and other coalitions to do it. So that's
When
kind
you
of,
do an access review with a hotel or a facility, do you do that in person?
yes,
Okay.
do it in person because you have to measure everything and see everything because they tell you they're accessible, but you need to see the rooms. Like you need to see if they say they have an accessible room, there's two different types of accessible rooms. There's the kind that you can wheel a wheelchair into a shower. And then there's the kind that have tubs that are accessible. So we look for both. And in the past, Marriott's have been, are the few hotels that tend to have them, not always though.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, because I did one, we were having a meeting and we had 2 wheelchair users that were going to be coming, and I did it in Minneapolis. And it was hard to find a hotel that had any. And then our meeting changed and we didn't end up needing it, but I was only looking at Marriott's. And it was hard because a lot of those, took over old buildings and they renovated them, but they didn't renovate them in, with accessible rooms that people really needed. And if we didn't have wheelchair users coming, it wouldn't have been as big an issue, but we knew we had 2 wheelchair users coming. So we wanted to make sure it was accessible. And the reason, just to be really frank, the reason we canceled the meeting that we were going to have was because we were going to have it in the, so you guys will get this. We were going to have it in the sheriff's office space. That's at the jail. At the jail, they don't have wands you have to go through a metal detector, but they don't have wands that like the airport has. So they were going to have to pat down the people who were coming through. And we had Keith and Charisse, who wasn't in the video, but 2 Black people in wheelchairs. And we were like, we are not going into the jail and having a heart, like that was just no. So we ended up having to do something entirely different. But
That's great.
So I apologize if we're asking a lot about and that's the thing, like we don't want to get caught on like physical spaces, right? Because that's
right.
one aspect of it.
One
we
aspect.
have 4 or 5 in-person events that are coming up very quickly. And so I think that at least like in my head, I'm like running through, because I'm doing a contract right now, right? And so I'm like, hey, what are these things? And so that's where some of that is coming from.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint and I'm going to talk about some of the other ways. There's also, I can send you also a link to, we have online tools around making other aspects of your work accessible. Or we can just schedule another time and I can walk you through that part. Okay, so let's go back to the PowerPoint. Okay, so physical access and barrier removal. A lot of times it's just moving stuff out of the way. Like I was at Monsoon and they had a whole bunch of boxes in the hallway and I was like, oh yeah, you guys should move those. Because people with, that had mobility issues wouldn't have been able to walk through there. And that's super easy. Okay, so then other common accommodations are ASL interpreters. So I wanted to say something about ASL interpreters. First of all, not everyone knows American Sign Language, and it's an easy thing to not know. Most people that are in deaf communities that are white will know American Sign Language, but there's also Black deaf people who can understand stuff in American Sign Language, but they learned Black Sign Language. So kind of being able to find interpreters like that, and then also finding BIPOC ASL interpreters, or we have a couple interpreters that we work with that are trilingual, meaning that they know English, that they know American Sign Language, and then they know another language, and it'll be LSM, which is Mexican Sign Language. So it's just kind of thinking through. We just established an interpretation line for programs who have deaf survivors that might not know how to reach out to identify and hire American Sign Language or other interpreters. So I can send you a link to that just so we have programs apply for it. We've had rounds because we can't offer it across the board to everyone. So we have programs that have applied for it. And then they go through a training process, and then they can access that. Also, we just got funding to do a language and service line. So that language and service line is for folks who haven't gotten to a program that can call that language, have a video relay, and then get referred to a deaf service program. And that is just kind of starting to, we're still in the formation process of that. But just so you know, and if you do end up hiring interpreters and you want access to programs, like access to BIPOC interpreters, let me know, because we work with a couple companies.
We actually do have our own kind of network of primarily Indigenous, but also, other POC kind of interpreters. And so that's been really nice, especially having folks who are not having to necessarily, it's not verbatim translation, right? You're not doing word for word. So really thinking about what are concepts, especially within Indigenous communities. And so that has been, I think, part of like what has been, spurring us to want to do more and to do better is by having these good relationships with our interpreters and having them like invite us into different spaces and to have those real conversations, right? Because they are part of our trainings in every single way. So yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, that's awesome. Because a lot of people, like I was at this conference, or I did this online one, this BIPOC leadership group. And because they added interpreters late, they had white interpreters at a program that was only for Black and brown people. So it was really interesting to see that, because now I'm spoiled because we always have BIPOC interpreters unless we're doing kind of our white supremacy with our white staff. Okay, so then, and then let me just double check. Anybody, Shayla, did you have a question? Are you good? Okay, cool. So putting materials in large font, it should be a norm to do that. And usually 14-point font is good. Putting materials into Braille is really helpful as well. Or making sure that your materials are, well, I shouldn't say and making sure your materials can be read through a screen reader. Plain language is really important. We, there's kind of like a thing to it, and we have an online course, but it's basically using accessible language and making one point within each sentence. Instead of, making multiple points, so that it's easier for someone to be able to follow. And then a lot of these, like the slow down and plan for more time, that I'm sure a lot of people are doing because that's very trauma informed. Communication devices. So that's communication boards or computer aided real-time transcription. A lot of people who have communication who aren't able to speak will use an AI program off of a tablet. so if they don't have access to that, being able to get access to that is important. And there are people in disability programs in states that provide accommodations, not necessarily because someone's a survivor, but because their role is to help people either find work or live independently. And then there's mobility aids like wheelchairs, walkers, canes, that are pretty common. And then physical modifications that we talked about. So the biggest challenge that we've seen around accessibility is the attitudes of the people at the program. So meaning that a lot of people don't either, let me see, how can I say this? Let me wait for a second and say, so the main thing is attitudinal. So if the program doesn't feel like they can do it, they don't try to do it. And then they'll say things like, well, we don't have anybody in our community, which isn't true. They just don't think they're accessible. Communication, it's really an easy thing to address. Just knowing kind of who to reach out to. And then again, physical, and then technological, like making sure that all your stuff is accessible, websites, and then access to different types of technology that can help with access. Like I talked about, like the tablet, what people can use to communicate. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about attitudinal. So when we work with someone, we know that there's no way that you can make everything that you do accessible all at once. So we work with people and we try to maintain and we try to encourage them to be flexible. It's hard though when you are short-staffed, having trouble hiring people, don't have the funding to hire more people, and you're being asked to do one more thing, and you don't think there's a big population in your community. So it's hard sometimes to get folks to kind of think that way. So planning in advance is what we kind of go to. So, okay, you're not accessible right now, but let's talk about like next year, or let's talk about the grants that you're about to apply for. You could put this in your budget. You can start doing, when you do your registrations for your webinars, you can start asking people if they need accommodations, or like there's just a bunch of different things that you can do planning in the future. You don't have to do it all right now. So it's a big challenge. And then we also are trying to get people to like think about what kinds of questions they can ask folks to try to figure out what kind of accommodations they might make. And then just remembering that this is treating people with respect. So if you're making your programs more accessible for folks, that's part of treating a person with a disability with respect, and having kind of, making sure your programs are inclusive. Because remember, we talked about last week, 1 in 5 people in the US have disabilities. Our programs are working with people with disabilities, whether they know it or not, because a lot of disabilities aren't obvious. So these are the ways kind of that we interact with folks around that. Around communication, these are the most common, which is ASL, closed captioning, and we use live closed captioning for our webinars, because the computer generated one isn't always accurate. And in our area, we're talking about stuff that you don't want the closed captioning, the transcript to look weird. And it can really easily. especially when you're thinking about sexual assault and sex trafficking and stuff like that. Plain language. Oh,
I
go
was just
ahead.
gonna point out, sorry, my camera's off, but I'm trying to eat lunch.
No, you're good.
But also like it's a requirement in the OVW grants to put money in for accessibility. So people should be thinking through what that means and more beyond, you know, like I think people always think of, well, is it physically accessible?
Right.
But thinking about all the other ways, like this is really helpful to think through. There's so many other ways to make something accessible beyond like thinking about, do I have, you know, wheelchair accessibility?
Right, exactly. And then, I mean, plain language is one of the easiest things to do, but it's also really hard because you're not like, for me, when I'm writing stuff, especially legal stuff, there's, you know, there's legal terms and terms of art and stuff. And so people really have to think about like, how would you explain this, you know, to someone who doesn't work in our field? And how can you get it, you know, make sure that they understand, and that makes it just a little bit easier. But there's a whole process for plain language, and there are places that have done stuff in plain language. And for like immigrant communities in particular, this is really helpful. They do pictorial guides. So you can do pictorial guides, and then you don't have to worry about whether it's accessible, either because the person has, you know, limited English proficiency or because the person has IDD. And then what happens is if you put this stuff, if you create this and do this now, then people don't have to ask for it. They don't have to disclose that they have a disability if it's not apparent. So these are just really common things that people can do, but it's scary for people because they don't know how to do it. So one of the things that we recommend is that universal design. And I think a lot of the tribal sexual assault programs are going to be doing a lot of this because it's accessible. Universal design is trauma informed. But so when you do universal design, what you're doing is you're assuming that the widest array of people will be participating and engaged in that process or program. It adds elements that support everyone being able to understand, communicate, and participate. And that way, people don't have to ask for it because it's built in. And then when people do need additional accommodations, that's what you're focusing on instead of adjusting your program constantly. Like if you do your program, it's kind of like thinking about the ADA as a floor. So if you make things accessible across the board, like you look at your physical, you look at whether your materials are accessible, language, whether they are okay for screen readers, whether you have information in Braille. Like if you kind of like think about the things that would be a floor, then you only have to change things when someone who needs an additional accommodation comes through. So that's why we recommend this universal approach. And it reduces the need. So then also you're going to see more people with disabilities in your programs because they're going to access it. And you know, it's a small community, word of mouth gets around. So here's an example. I like this because everybody's gotten a ticket in their time of something that's not accessible. So they could easily create this document in large print. They could use multilingual explainer videos or pamphlets, maps and signage to help navigate different buildings and agencies, made available in person and online. They could redesign their forms. So the thing that I used to always advocate for, whether it was language access because of spoken language or now because of plain language, is I would take anything that people have to sign and recreate that in plain language. Because people need to be able to understand what they're signing. And then I would look at the things that people kind of walk in and have to have. And that's where I would start. And then I would go from there. And there's some great places that will also put things in plain language for you. The Autistic Self-Advocacy Network does a lot in plain language. Their website is amazing in terms of the stuff that they have in plain language. They've developed lots of videos, which are really helpful for people. So it's just a place to start. But again, the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network is also very wide. So most of their stuff is, I've looked at a lot of their stuff and it feels like it's transferable, but it might not be. So then individual accommodations, like remember, so it's reasonable accommodations under the Americans with Disabilities Act. That's to me the floor. So that would be like, let's say I'm going to take a workplace setting just as an example. Let's say I'm working for you and I have DID, and that means that I need things a certain way in order for me to be my, most productive. And I'm trying to think of an example that okay, so here's an example that's actually something that you all will have to deal with if you pay for me to travel to San Francisco. I need to travel first class because with my DID comes a panic disorder. And so that's that you don't actually have to do that. Like if you were my employer, if you want me to travel, that's something that I need. But that might not be reasonable because the cost is too high. So what they do is kind of like this balancing act to figure out whether something is considered reasonable or not, which is the request, can you meet the request a different way, and a way that's not as costly. So if it doesn't fit in your budget, can you do it differently? Or does this person have to do this? So that's kind of the way you look at it when you're talking, as an employment. When you're talking about services, you only need to do what's considered reasonable. But the thing is we have critical services. So then the reasonable test for like your service programs for tribal, let's say tribal sexual assault or sex trafficking programs, is can this person access these services as well as someone who does not have a disability? So that's going to be the measure for them. And so that doesn't mean renovating a building because the building is not accessible. That means, can you find an accessible place where you can meet with survivors? So it's just kind of taking a look at that. And it allows, someone to fully participate and benefit from whatever programs are being offered. And so here's the thing. So again, this is what the law says, but I'll tell you what our practice is. So the law would require someone to disclose that they have the need and the disability, that there is trust and quality communication so people feel comfortable making the request, meaning that someone is not going to be kicked out of a program, fired, demoted because they have made a request. And then understanding the process and program in order to make an informed request. So people need to know that this is available to them. So our organization, because we center disability and deafness, we only need people to let us know if they need an accommodation, but we don't need to know what disability or why or anything like that. And then we try, again, we're trying to do the floor. So we have, for example, we have a third of our staff are deaf. So we have ASL interpreters. We have Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays. We're all day. We have ASL interpreters. So that's our norm. If we need more, then someone asks for. So it's really kind of looking at how you do things and how can you make everything more accessible. And that's why planning is so important.
Well,
Go ahead, Jolene.
I was gonna, like, one of the areas where I've kind of always struggled with is how to, so, because like thinking about like meetings, conferences, spaces like that, right? A lot of the actual work and the relationship building is done in like after hours things, right?
Right.
And that's one of the harder areas for me, because also like in my head, I'm just like, we can just walk everywhere, right? And so I will name that, right? But wanting to make sure, like, how are we, if people are want to, because also at the end of the day, some people are just tapped out, either physically, emotionally, all that kind of stuff. And that's okay to, you know, go to your room and just do what you got to do, right? But also thinking about how even like we want to create, like, it's almost easier to create the accessible space in like an official training, right? But how to create full environments where people aren't, you know, disenfranchised or like pushed to the side when it comes to the socializing aspect as well. It's just something that I have kind of struggled with it.
It's a really, really good point. Jolene, because so think about if you're doing that at night. Okay, so I'm going to use myself as an example again. When I've gotten through a day of being around people, I go back to my room. It's very hard for me to then go out and socialize with people, aka why I've canceled so many dinner plans for people in the past. I always want to be able to, but I can't. And so then if you create all your networking opportunities after a full day, you are actually making it inaccessible for people who aren't able to do that. So I think building in networking opportunities throughout the day is the more accessible way to go. And also, if you have deaf participants, ASL interpreters are done at the end of the day. And so then, unless you hire additional interpretation for those networking opportunities, they won't have access to it either. And you can't ask, I mean, you can, but you should not ask interpreters to then work, like if they're there working the day, to then work the evening for dinner, because they can't eat when they're, working. So. And Shayla, did you have any thoughts? Did you want to share? No? Okay, cool.
We just want to be on camera.
I want you to. I love it. I just want to make sure I'm not like missing somebody.
This is really helpful, Olga. And thank you for the example that you brought up around like accommodations while flying. And like, I'm curious because like that specific, like we've talked to OVW about like, you know, because there's a lot of guidelines around how you use their money.
Right.
And using coach transportation, you know, like, and so I actually asked GFMD about that, like just making accommodations for people. And they told us that we had to have
a letter.
Saying that we had the accommodation.
Yep, I have a letter because I'm about to do this for the Center for Justice Innovation. They bought my airline ticket to go do a training for them. And in the process of just saying, hey, because I worry about it so much, in the process of saying they wanted me to do this training, I said, so only thing I want to let you know is that I have an accommodation where I fly first class, let me know what kind of paperwork you need for that. Wrote back and they said, oh, we've never done this before. What would you recommend? And I said, well, our policy is that we get a memo that says that we need this accommodation. And I actually, because I wrote about having DID, it's like, it's not a secret why I need it. So I wrote why specifically. Now, what someone could do is say that they have, an invisible disability that makes it difficult for them to fly. this enables them to be able to do that. And that's only if the person's willing to fly. Some people will drive everywhere or take the train. But so I can send you the memo that I use. I'll probably need to send it to you anyway if I'm going to your sex trafficking conference. But I specifically put why. So here, let me just pull it up so I can read it real quick. But I pretty much, and because this is the law that I practiced, I'm pretty used to, oh, there it was. 1 second. Here it is. So it's always a memo to whoever it is that is making the decision. So it would probably, let's say it would either be to Morgan or to you, Nicole, for the sex trafficking. And then I put who, and then I say, as you know, I'm in so-and-so, I'll be traveling to whatever conference it is to do this thing. I'm requesting an accommodation in accordance with the ADA. I need to fly first class. And then I have a double problem. I need to fly first class and on Delta Airlines because the panic disorder comes up when things are different than I expect. So this, and I explain that in order to make it possible for me to travel, as you know, I disclosed I have dissociative identity disorder and an anxiety and panic disorder. That means it's very difficult for me to fly. Flying in first class and flying on Delta, the carrier I am familiar with, helps me with those two conditions, and it makes it possible for me to do airline travel. So I lay out specifically what the request is. I tell you what the disorder is, and then I tell you how it connects to the request. And so someone doesn't have to be as specific as I am. And they can just say, I have a psychiatric disability, or I have an invisible disability. It's just, and then the key for auditors is that you have a policy.
Yeah.
And usually what happens is, like, we will, if somebody's trying to do something that's out of the norm, like one of our consultants wanted to rent a car and drive to a training that we were having him do instead of flying, because we don't have a car rental policy, because of the liability issues. And so we had him do it through his organization, following their policy, and then we would reimburse the invoice. And we've been audited 3 times over the years. And so they're really, Charity and Nancy are very thoughtful about how they do stuff, and so that when the auditors come in, that we have the paperwork that we need.
Thank you. This is so helpful. And if you all are willing to like share your policy, I would love to see it.
Okay. Yeah. It's our accommodations policy. You would need to, so it's for our employees. So you would just adapt it for your conferences.
That would be so
for
helpful.
both, right?
Mm-hmm.
I also want to name, I just feel so seen. Like, I have felt like a baby, for lack of better words, for being like, not flying on Delta stresses me out. Like the idea, I haven't flown anything. I can now fly Southwest a little bit.
Me too.
But anything beyond those two, I haven't flown them in like 7-8 years.
Yeah.
And like, it just sets my mind like a panic, right? And I'm like, could I probably get through it? Yes, but the idea of it is just so anxiety induced. Like, it's, so I just want to thank you for naming that. I don't know how to like that. I've never heard anybody
thanks.
articulate it. So.
I know, and people get mad because not at our organization, and really because, like, what I used to do was just pay the difference myself, and I just can't afford to do that anymore. It's gotten so expensive. So, and it's because people have giving me like kind of side eye is the only way I can describe it about the request. And I'm like, I travel a lot. And if I get on a plane and I have a panic attack, getting back on a plane is going to be much, much harder for me. So, and I'm not going to be able to train when I get to where I'm going. So, yeah, it's tricky. It's tricky. So so you can practice this, you can look at this, like I'll send you our accommodations. And remember, we center disability, so ours is going to be just a little bit more involved, and we lean into trying to be more accessible. And then you can, and I'll look at our travel policy to see if we have anything in there about, but we've been doing it for consultants for a really long time. So when I asked for it as a staff person, they're like, of course, because we do it for consultants. So I'll pull together what we have and send them to you.
Thank you. That'd be so helpful. Like we created one, but it was like, we were like told by GFMD, like, here's the policy and you should adopt this. And
Okay.
so I would like to have, to look at how we could not be so, like how we can create our own policy that's more.
Yeah, because you can. And especially because you have HHS funding as well. So you could, and HHS funding is more flexible than justice funding. So the main thing that we found was if you have a policy and it's reasonable, then you follow your policy. So, and ADA requires it. So, okay. So let me go back
Thank
to,
you.
and are we okay in terms of, do people need to take a break?
I'm sort of just trusting that especially when we're off camera, we are all just kind of breaking and taking care of our needs as
Oh,
it
cool.
should be.
Okay.
But do you need a break? Do you need doggies? Do you need?
Oh, yeah, let me let them in. I'll be right back.